Hi, I am not Aiden Paladin. My name is Coach Red Pill, and I'm filling in for Aiden as she's traveling. She asked me if I could fill in, and I said I'd be delighted. And I asked her what she would like me to talk about, and she said Austrian economics. Now, this isn't something that I usually cover in my own channel, so I thought it would be a lot of fun. Sort of like to get outside my own comfort zone, and at the same time contribute something to Aiden's channel. I hope you enjoy this post. Now, Austrian economics is a very popular economic idea or concept or ideology among libertarians. Now, I'm going to go into it, but in order to understand Austrian economics, you have to understand a little bit about economics in general. So this post is going to be a little bit of a primer for economic thinking at the macroeconomic level. Now, I'm going to go through all of the different schools and the orthodox and heterodox and unorthodox schools, as it were, and give you sort of like a bird's eye view of the whole situation. All right? Now, you go to different economists and you know the differences between one and the other. Every single economist has his own ideas. So what I'm going to have to do is sort of like turn up the contrast, as it were, so that, you know, things pop out more easily. And of course, inevitably, in order to do that, I'm going to oversimplify a lot of different concepts. But for this post, I'm deliberately aiming it for people who don't have any idea about economic thinking and have only the vaguest notion of what Austrian economics is. Those who are more knowledgeable will listen to me and say, well, you know, you're glossing over a whole bunch of really important concepts and really important ideas. And I'll say, yes, I am, so that it's more easily digestible to those who don't have much experience with the matter. Okay? Now, modern economic thinking and theory started really shortly after the end of World War I. Of course, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, was the first proper economic textbook, as it were. Economics came out of political theory. And starting in the 1930s and the 1940s, it integrated physics, specifically fluid dynamics, into its thinking, because fluid dynamics is very useful in understanding how money flows through a system. Now, this is at what is called the microeconomic level. That is the level of companies and small industries, relatively small industries, to understand how money flows within those closed systems. But as you start going up and up, and you start looking at an entire economy of a country, things get a little less scientific. And in point of fact, you could argue that at a certain level, economic ideas become economic ideologies. So in a very real sense, I'm going to be talking about the current thinking and the current ideologies that are in vogue. Because as of this time, and it's very important that you realize this, there is no consensus as to which economic theory actually works. And in point of fact, one could argue that none of them worked, because no economic theory has been particularly accurate in predicting what will happen at the macroeconomic level. And everybody who is critical of contemporary economic thinking points to the 2008 global financial crisis. No orthodox and almost no heterodox economic theory predicted what would happen in 2008. Right? They didn't even see it coming, not even close. It was only after the fact they were like, oh yeah, that happened. But before, you see? So as a science, economics is not a particularly successful science. It is a social science, and it should be thought of as such. And economic thinking should be thought of, often as not, as almost a religion. Okay? Now, in current economic thinking, there are essentially orthodox and heterodox or unorthodox schools of thinking. Now, the orthodox is what is dominant in academia and in the central banks. The orthodox schools of thinking, of economic thinking, are principally two: Keynesianism and monetarism. I'll get to those in a second. But those that are not either Keynesian or monetarist are considered either heterodox or unorthodox. The unorthodox is basically, those are sort of like variations of those two. All right. Now, heterodox economic thinking are those ideas, ideologies, schools of thought that run completely contrary to either monetarism or Keynesianism. Among them is the Austrian school, but there are a lot of other schools in it. I mean, almost an infinite number you could think of it, and most of them are completely absurd. For instance, anarcho-capitalism. A lot of people, young people, who don't know better, think that anarcho-capitalism sounds great. Oh, we'll all be anarchists rather, and we'll just, free markets and no government. But of course, you run into the first roadblock almost immediately, which is, see, if you don't have a government or any kind of overriding authority, who is going to guarantee that contracts are fulfilled? You see the problem? Because without the state or something like it, where you can take somebody who doesn't fulfill contract, you can take him to court and get damages, then no contract is worth the paper it's printed on. And if you don't have contracts in a capitalist economy, you don't have a capitalist economy. Nothing's going to happen. It's just going to be chaos. In a week's time, there'll be riots in the streets and no food for anybody. A weekend, you see? So anarcho-capitalism, for example, is an idiotic theory. It sounds great. It sounds like a lot of fun. But it's for teenagers and people who aren't serious. If you're serious, the schools that are unorthodox are relatively few. Principally, the Austrian school, and a fairly little-known school that is emerging. They call it neo-Keynesianism, but it's not really Keynesianism, and I'm going to get to Keynesianism in just a second. It's centered around an economist called Hyman Minsky, who passed away in '96, I believe. Hyman Minsky and his adherents principally, actually predicted the 2008 global financial crisis. The 2008 financial crisis, which I'm going to refer to often, was a deciding moment in economic theory because since nobody saw it coming except a few Minskyites, but since the orthodox economists at all of the central bank, at the Federal Reserve, at the European Central Bank, at the International Bank, the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, none of them saw the 2008 crisis coming. None of them. And point of fact, it caught them not only flat-footed, it sent them into a panic, and it sent modern economic thinking into a tailspin because modern economists could not predict this catastrophe, which very nearly wiped out the global economy. I mean, we came within inches of total oblivion. And nobody really wants to talk about it now. And the measures that have been taking place since then are sort of like a patchwork of measures to prevent it from happening again. But I'll get to that in a minute. Let's go back to the divisions. As I said, there's orthodox economics and unorthodox economics. Unorthodox, why is it orthodox and why is it unorthodox? Well, because the orthodox economists are principally in universities and central banks. No central bank or major university teaches Austrian economics. It is heterodox. It is outside the norm. Let's look at the orthodox economists. Now, as I said, there are two, Keynesians and monetarists. Now, both of them have the notion that the health of an economy is determined by the growth of GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. You see, gross domestic product is made up of all of the consumption and all of the growth of an economy as measured by a fairly simple formula. You basically add up all that you spend, and that's GDP. That is, all that you spend as a country. That's GDP. The difference between monetarists and Keynesians is essentially that, well, Keynesians view the government as the engine of growth. They believe that the government has to add more growth to the economy by way of spending to ensure that companies, the private sector that goes up and down, as it were, the government spending will even it out, will fill in the gaps, as it were. Imagine government spending as caulk that's put there in the cracks in the cement, that kind of thinking, you see? Now, this is all good and fine in theory, and in practice, it seems to work. It worked during the Depression. You see, During the Depression, there was what is called deflation. That is, people started spending less because they had less money or less certainty as to their employment. As they spent less, they bought less, and those that manufactured those products, companies, factories, what have you, since they had fewer sales, they wound up firing people. And as they fired people, those people who had been fired spent less. And as they spent less, consumed less, more factories shut down and more people were left unemployed, and it became a self-reinforcing cycle. That's called deflation. It's very important. Now, John Maynard Keynes wrote his famous book during this period, and he was describing what the Roosevelt administration was actually doing, which was the Roosevelt administration came in 1933 and just spent a boatload of money. Keynesians are all about what's called aggregate demand. That is, the more you spend, the more the economy is healthy, and so you have to keep on adding, That is basically Keynesianism. Government spending will fix the economy. Now, monetarists, on the other hand, believe that the money supply, hence the name monetarists, the money supply is what determines growth. Greater money supply, more growth. But the problem being is that more money supply, more possibility of inflation. Because that's one of the problems of Keynesian economics. Let's see, as the government spends more and more and more, prices tend to rise. And as prices tend to rise, it creates havoc in the economy. And so monetarists look at interest rates as the key mechanism. The central bank has to adjust interest rates, fine-tune the economy. As it lowers interest rates, money becomes cheaper, more readily available by way of banks that lend money. There's more consumption. And then as inflation starts to rise, monetarists raise the price of money by way of the central bank, cooling the economy, as it were, taking away the punch bowl, as it were. And it's the role of the central bank to raise and lower interest rates to maintain a steady pace to the economy. Okay. Now, these schools, these orthodox schools, crash. I mean, they're like two gangs that almost hate each other. Like, think of them as the Bloods and the Crips, right? And the thing is, of course, just like the Bloods and the Crips, the differences between them are very, very minor. I mean, they're a classic example of Freud's, narcissism of small differences. They claim that they have huge differences one and the other, but both of them fundamentally think that GDP is the measure of the health of an economy. More consumption, more growth of GDP, the better for the economy. Now, Austrians, who are very much on the outside looking in, they counter that GDP cannot be a good measure of the economy. And in point of fact, I agree with that assessment. I don't agree with the Austrians, which I'll explain in a moment, but that assessment is accurate because of the following. They reason basically along the following lines. Suppose I earn $1,000 a month, right? And I have a credit card that has a $500 a month limit, but I can just keep on zipping it up until, a $50,000 top limit, but only $500 per month, say, just for the sake of this example. So I take my salary of $1,000, I spend it all, okay? Now, at the end of the year, I spent $12,000, right? Because I got in $1,000 and I spent $500 on rent, $100 on food and, all the rest of it. And at the end of the day, I spent $12,000, right? So that's GDP. That's how much money was spent in a year. But say I take that credit card that has that $500 per month limit and I zip it every month for $500. Well, 12 months, $500, that's $6,000. So I spent all my salary plus that $500 from the credit card and accrued that debt, right? And so at the end of the year, I spent $18,000. Now, monetarists and Keynesians, that is, orthodox economists, would say, well, 18,000 is more than 12,000, so the economy grew more. But Austrians would say, well, you went into debt. Yeah, sure, you consumed it, but what is debt? It's bringing forward, tomorrow's earnings, as it were. Okay? And you have that burden of having to pay interest rates and having to make payments on the principal of the loan. So it becomes a burden. Yeah, sure, you spent $6,000 more. You had more fun today, but you're going to pay for it tomorrow. That is essentially, in very basic and broad strokes, the criticism of the Austrian school against orthodox economics. Now, the Austrian school, as I said, is outside of the central banks, outside of academia, and its basic idea is that with greater economic freedom comes greater political and social freedom. And sometimes they claim moral freedom, although I've never quite understood that claim. And I'll get to that in a second. Now, it sounds on its face like a really great idea. You know, it sounds that you're saying that, yeah, sure, if you have more free markets, more economic freedom, people are free to choose whatever they want insofar as, you know, buying this or that or doing whatever, building a factory or what have you. And so that's like a freer society, isn't it? It is a freer society, isn't it? Well, how exactly is it politically more free? Because I can name several countries that had a lot of economic freedom, but were politically repressive. The country I lived in Chile. Chile had a dictatorship from 1973 to 1990. And during that dictatorship, especially during the 1970s, there was a whole boatload of economic freedom, but it was a dictatorship. I mean, they said, they didn't screw around, they didn't pretend it was a democratic republic of anything. They said, this is a dictatorship, and this is the dictator, and this is the junta, you know? But there was boatloads of economic freedom. So, you know, it doesn't correlate. There's certainly no causal relation between economic freedom and political freedom. And in correlation, there isn't either. So that, you know, because that's the thing with Austrians, you know, free markets, free people. But it is unclear that there is any such correlation. And when in fact there are so many examples of having one without the other, in both directions by the way, that it's unclear what they're exactly talking about, okay? And Austrian economics depends on what's known as the business cycle. Now the business cycle, a lot of Austrian economists talk about it, write about it, fill it out. But you start looking at it from a more macro level and it sounds a little bit like a fairy tale. Because in point of fact, that's what orthodox economists say about Austrian economics, that it is a fairy tale. The business cycle is supposed to be that, you know, businesses rise and fall in a cyclical pattern. And that's all good and fine. And a lot of Austrians have sort of like filled in the blanks of that. But why is this the case? You know, what starts it, what ends it, you know, why exactly? They don't answer that. You see, Austrians sort of dismiss that and say, oh, you haven't really studied Austrian economics. But here's the problem. You see, the orthodox economists, the Keynesians and the monetarists, they're not stupid people. They're very, very smart. Now, you can disagree. You can say that GDP is not an accurate measure of the economy, and I would fully agree with you. But to claim that orthodox economists are stupid is disingenuous at best. They are very sharp customers. And they have looked at Austrian economics. And here's the kicker, the thing that you should look at. You see, if Austrian economics was such a great idea, it would have been integrated, now wouldn't it? I mean, a lot of people would have taken the ideas of the Austrians and used it. Because Austrians essentially believe that savings and investment are the true measures of an economy. Now, on its face, that sounds very reasonable. You're saying, yeah, the more you save, the more you invest in factories and this and that, you know, the healthier and stronger the economy, the more it grows and what have you. And it sounds like a terrific idea. It sounds logical, right? Because if I save a lot of money, right? If I save, I have an income and I save it, that savings grows. If I save, for instance, 25% of my monthly earnings, you know, at the end of the year, I have 3 months of living expenses saved up. That's great, isn't it? Well, yeah, but think of it on a macro level, okay? Not the micro level, because on the personal level, sure, you're absolutely right. If you save a quarter of your salary, it's terrific for you, okay? But look at it from the macro perspective, something that Austrians hate to do, because they sort of like discard the notion of looking at statistical analyses of societies and the overarching society and the groups within it, and they tend to focus on the individual. On an individual basis, Austrian economics is great. On a societal level, on a macro, you know, with millions of people in an economy, it's a complete disaster, and I'll explain why. Because see, Orthodox economists who've been spooked by the Great Depression take one look at Austrian economics and they say, this is a recipe for the Great Depression of 1929 to 1941. And they're absolutely true. It's absolutely accurate assessment. Because you see, what happened during the Depression? The Depression, as I explained before, people consumed less. As they consumed less, factories that produce goods and services stopped producing those goods and services because there were no buyers. And as there were no buyers, they started shutting down their factories. As they shut down their factories, they put people out on the streets unemployed. And those people who are now newly unemployed consumed even less. And it became a self-reinforcing cycle. Austrian economics, for all intents and purposes, is saying, oh yeah, that's the way to go. We should do that, yay! Nobody in the orthodox economic sphere can take such ideas seriously. Those people who are outside of economics and look at Austrian economics on a personal level think it sounds great because on a personal level it is a great idea. As a moral approach to personal finance, it's fantastic. On a societal policy level, with millions of people in an economy, with hundreds of different, thousands of different industries, and potentially millions of factories, Austrian economics is a recipe for disaster. Okay? It has a lot of things that are valuable as critiques of orthodox economics. But in and of itself, if it were actually plugged into an economy, the modern economy of today would crash within a year. Okay, and that's disregarding all the current problems that we have at the macroeconomic level, because the current economy is very, very fragile, extremely fragile. But I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Now, why is Austrian economics so attractive? Because, as I said, it sort of like makes sense on a personal level. And it appeals to our notions of, prudence, of not overspending. And Keynesianism, on the other hand, it makes people who are normally personally prudent, it makes them tear their hair out. Because Keynesianism is basically saying, yeah, go into debt. Debt doesn't matter. The government should go into as much debt as possible in order to maximize consumption. Who else is seriously against orthodox economists are those conservationists and environmentalists who are more thoughtful, who have more of an economic bent. They too are against Keynesianism and monetarism for that matter, because as I said, they're twin brothers. They're very closely aligned. They're just a difference in approach to basically the same thing, growing GDP. Environmentalists, conservationists, they don't want to grow GDP because they don't want more industry that will destroy the environment. Okay, so that's something to think about, but that's just parenthetical. Now, there is one group of people who are heterodox, that is outside the establishment, that actually have good ideas. And that is the group around Hyman Minsky. Well, as I said, Hyman Minsky passed away. But his ideas lived on, and they are great ideas. Now, his whole thing was the notion of debt. Because here's the weird thing about modern economics, both orthodox and heterodox. Modern economics does not pay much attention to debt. Orthodox economists view debt as an asset. See, if I go into debt, I take your money and I give you an IOU, right? Orthodox economists say that you have basically replaced cash with an asset, the IOU. Because potentially I'm paying you a little bit of interest on that IOU. Like every month I'll pay you, like I borrowed $100 and I pay you, for the sake of argument, I pay you $1.50 every month, right? So you're getting income. So it's an asset for you. That's how orthodox economists, both monetarists and Keynesians, view debt, right? And so more debt is actually a good thing because it puts more cash into the system, more consumption, and it creates assets. Yay team, right? Hyman Minsky and the group who follow him, it's a nascent group. They're sometimes called neo-Keynesianism because Hyman Minsky was a Keynesian, but unlike most Keynesians, if not all Keynesians, he paid attention to debt. He thought that debt was the key moment. And after he passed away, a few years ago, in 2006 or 7, I believe, there was this trader, his name slips my mind right now, he coined the term the Minsky moment. This is a key concept. The Minsky moment is very simple. Say you go into debt. Say, you know, to make it personal and make it simple to understand. Say that you earn $1,000 a month, but, you know, you spend $1,200 a month. So every month you go into $200 worth of debt. And, you know, soon enough you max out your credit card. Your credit card, just for the sake of argument, has, say, a $5,000 limit. So you max out your credit card, and so you get a second credit card. And with that second credit card, not only do you pay that shortfall of $200 a month, you also pay the interest on the first card. And you also zip the second card to pay the interest on that second card, okay? And you keep on doing it, maxing out credit cards. And, well, what's going to happen? Eventually, you're going to get to a point where you can't afford to pay the debt, and you can't get another credit card. And you know, that's it. It's essentially bankruptcy. I'm simplifying, of course, but this is the Minsky moment. The moment when you cannot acquire more debt to pay the previous debt that you have already accrued. It's when the system collapses. Essentially what happened in 2008. And that's the issue with Hyman Minsky and his thinking. His adherents were the only ones who predicted the 2008 economic crisis. And that's why his theories are so interesting. Furthermore, Hyman Minsky rejected the whole notion of importing physics and fluid dynamics into economics in order to figure it out. And this is really fascinating, you see? Because that's the reason that orthodox economists don't pay attention to Hyman Minsky and his adherents. Because they say, oh, they're unsophisticated, they don't understand that it's all numbers and math and physics and all the rest of it. Because Hyman Minsky and his adherents recognize that economics, to a great extent, is still an art form. It's not a science, not even close. And for it to have imported physics as it did during especially the 1940s and 50s, Paul Samuelson was a key individual in this move. But economics is using physics the way a child is using a gun. He doesn't know what it's doing with it. Okay? Now, of course, using physics in economics is not as dangerous, of course, as a 4-year-old, you know, starting around with a Magnum 457 or whatever. But in a way, it is as dangerous, because what happens is that you get blindness of policymakers. They think that the economists know what they're doing. So, this is a little bit of a macro view of the different economic theories. Austrian economic thinking is extremely attractive on a moral level, but as you start looking at it in a practical sense, you realize that it is not very useful. It seems useful, but it really is useful on a personal level. On a macro policy level, it's not. I would suggest that rather than pay attention to Austrian economists, which a lot of libertarians are enamored of it, and they look at it like, you know, the be-all, end-all, like a religion. Because that's the problem with economics. People aren't looking at it on a logical level. They are looking at it like it's a religion. Now that's my overview of economics and a very simplified, extremely simplified explanation of Austrian economics. Of course, this is just a primer. I would suggest that you look into it. You have to keep in mind that none of these economic theories behaves like a science, in the sense that none of them can accurately predict what will happen in the economy. In point of fact, our economy, the global economy, the Western economies, are in serious trouble. Right now, there is what would be known as a asset price inflation, whereby real estate, stocks, bonds, every single asset class that you can imagine is seriously overpriced, absurdly overpriced. And this is because of the measures that the central banks, that is the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, have imposed in order to prop up the global economy following the 2008 global financial crisis. The global financial crisis was a cataclysmic event, and the causes of it have not been solved. They've only been ameliorated by way of money. A lot of money that was printed. A lot of Austrians point to the fact that all of this money printing will eventually lead to a disaster. And they are right. Okay? But the problem is that the Austrians do not present a reasonable alternative to either orthodox economic thinking or other heterodox economic thinking. And the policy prescriptions that the Austrians are promulgating would guarantee a massive depression. And so that's why nobody takes Austrians seriously. But they're worth reading. They're worth reading because they make you think. And as you realize that the people who have written Austrian economic thinking are very smart people, do keep in mind that the orthodox economists, though I believe that they are misguided, they are equally intelligent. Everybody's very smart here, and that's the problem. See, because if they were all dumb, it would be easy to find out and figure out which one is the correct answer. But you're going to have to figure it out on your own.